Emily Carter, Daniel Carter, and Michael Hayes. Three names tied together by desire, secrets, and lies until a forbidden affair spiraled into blackmail, a shocking murder, and the revelation of a past that destroyed everything. Emily Carter lived in a quiet neighborhood where every house looked alike and every routine blended into the next. She was the kind of woman who waved at her neighbors, kept her yard in perfect order, and seemed to always know when someone needed help. People admired her composure and her devotion to her husband, Daniel. Together, they looked like the kind of couple who had it all figured out, their lives neatly packaged into early morning commutes, shared dinners, and holiday gatherings. To the outside world, Emily appeared to be exactly what she wanted them to see, stable, dependable, and happy. But beneath that polished exterior, Emily carried a truth she had never shared with Daniel or anyone in the town where they lived. Years earlier, long before she met Daniel, Emily had transitioned. She had left behind an identity that no longer reflected who she truly was, and for years she had lived without looking back. It was not shame that kept her silent but fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and most of all, fear of losing the life she had worked so hard to build. Daniel had fallen in love with her as she was, and Emily never allowed herself to imagine what would happen if he discovered the parts of her history she had carefully locked away. Her silence might have remained undisturbed if not for a mistake that changed everything. At work, she crossed paths with Michael Hayes, a colleague whose presence drew her in. What began as harmless conversations turned into longer lunches and private exchanges. Michael was charismatic in ways Daniel was not, unpredictable and full of reckless charm. Emily, caught in a moment of weakness, allowed the connection to deepen. The excitement of the affair gave her a rush that distracted her from the fears that had always lived in the back of her mind. The meetings became more frequent. They met in cars parked in empty lots, in coffee shops far from their offices, and eventually in motel rooms where Emily shed the role of the perfect wife and gave in to the thrill of secrecy. For Michael, Emily was more than just a lover. She was a mystery that consumed him. He wanted to know everything about her, to peel back every layer until there were no secrets left. Emily thought she could control it, that she could draw a line and keep the two parts of her life separate. But affairs have a way of spiraling beyond control. Soon her attention at home slipped. Daniel noticed her distracted glances, her late arrivals, and the way she seemed lost in thought even when sitting across the table from him. Emily brushed off his concerns, inventing excuses about work stress or exhaustion. Inside, though, she knew the truth was more dangerous than she could admit. As weeks turned into months, guilt weighed on her. The thrill of the affair had begun to sour. What once felt exciting now felt dangerous. Every time she looked at Daniel, she felt the sharp edge of betrayal. She knew she had to end things with Michael before the affair unraveled the life she had fought so hard to protect. But Michael wasn't the kind of man who accepted rejection easily. When Emily told him she could no longer see him, his charm vanished, replaced by a sharpness that unsettled her. He grew possessive, texting her constantly, calling at odd hours, and appearing unannounced. Emily tried to pull away, but Michael only tightened his grip. His obsession began to frighten her, though she tried to hide her fear behind polite refusals. Still, she had no idea just how dangerous his obsession would become. Michael wasn't content with losing her. He wanted control, and he was willing to dig into places Emily had spent years burying. In his desperation to keep her, he began searching for the truths she never shared, truths that even Daniel did not know. And once he uncovered them, Emily's carefully constructed life would be torn apart in ways she could never have imagined. The secret she had kept hidden for so long was no longer safe. It hovered at the edge of exposure, waiting for the moment when someone else would drag it into the light. For Emily, the life she had built was already beginning to crack. She didn't yet know how far Michael would go, or how much she stood to lose, but the shadows were already closing in. The quiet, perfect life that once seemed untouchable was now under threat, and her own choices had set the chain of events in motion. Michael Hayes was not a man who could let go once he became attached. When Emily told him their affair was over, he didn't hear the word end. He heard a challenge, something to overcome. What began as a rush of passion now grew into an obsession that consumed him day and night. He wanted to own her attention, her secrets, her life. He started following her without her noticing, memorizing her routines, watching her from across parking lots, and even driving past her house late at night just to see if Daniel's car was in the driveway. What had once been hidden excitement now shifted into something dark and menacing. At first, Emily thought he was just angry, that his jealousy would fade with time. But Michael's behavior quickly proved otherwise. He left her notes that were short and cryptic, slipped under her windshield wiper or folded inside her work folder. Some were pleading, asking her to come back to him. Others carried threats disguised as warnings. The first time she read his words promising that she would regret walking away, her stomach tightened with a fear she had not felt before. The turning point came when Michael began digging into her past. Emily had worked hard to erase every trace of who she once was. She moved cities, built a new identity, and carefully kept her transition out of reach from anyone who might use it against her. But Michael had a stubborn determination that bordered on dangerous obsession. He searched public records, combed through online databases, and pieced together fragments of information that most people would have overlooked. Slowly, he began to uncover the life Emily thought she had buried forever. One night, she returned to her car after work to find a plain envelope tucked beneath the wiper blade. Inside were copies of old documents, fragments of her medical history and outdated ID, and scribbled notes written in Michael's hand. The message was clear: he knew her truth, and he was going to use it against her. Her entire body trembled as she sat in the driver's seat, staring at the papers. It was no longer about the affair, it was about survival. Michael now had the power to destroy everything. He called her phone late at night, his voice calm and chilling. He didn't ask her to come back anymore. Instead, he told her exactly what he would do if she didn't obey him. He promised to tell Daniel. He promised to tell her neighbors. He promised to make sure no one ever looked at her the same way again. Emily's mind raced with panic. The secret she had lived with for so long, the one she had built her entire life around protecting, was now hanging by a thread. At home, Daniel began noticing her unraveling. Emily was quieter, restless, and constantly distracted. She would sit at the dinner table pushing food around her plate, staring into the distance as though she were somewhere else entirely. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, flinching every time her phone buzzed. Daniel asked questions, but Emily gave vague answers about work stress or exhaustion. She couldn't tell him the truth. How could she admit that she had betrayed him, and that the man she betrayed him with now held the key to her darkest secret? The pressure grew heavier with every passing day. Emily avoided Michael as best she could, but he always found ways to remind her that she wasn't free. A text would appear just as she was about to walk into the office, reminding her that he was watching. A voicemail would play her own address back to her, spoken in his calm, steady tone. Sometimes, she thought she saw his car parked on the corner near her home, engine running, headlights dim. Each time she looked over her shoulder, her heart raced with dread. Then came the letter that shattered what little strength she had left. One evening, after arriving home, she noticed an envelope tucked under her front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, Michael had written details of her past in bold letters, ending with a threat that froze her in place. If she didn't leave Daniel for him, he would reveal everything. She knew at that moment that Michael was no longer bluffing. He was preparing to expose her in the most humiliating way possible. Emily sat in her living room with the letter trembling in her hands, the walls around her seeming to close in. She felt trapped between two unbearable choices: surrender to Michael's control and lose herself completely, or risk having her secret dragged into the open and destroying her marriage. The life she had fought to build, the respect she had earned, and the love she had shared with Daniel all felt as though they were seconds away from collapsing. In that moment, Emily realized she was no longer living her own life. Michael had taken control of her future, and unless she found a way to stop him, she would lose everything. The silence that had once protected her was now suffocating her, and she had no idea where the breaking point would lead. Emily felt her world crumbling as Michael's threats grew sharper and more dangerous. She could no longer dismiss him as a man who was simply hurt. He had become unpredictable, his obsession blending with his need for control. She had tried ignoring his texts and calls, but silence only seemed to make him angrier. Each message was more chilling than the last, and each warning reminded her that her secret was dangling over a cliff, ready to be pushed off at any moment. Finally, Emily decided to confront him. She thought that if she met him one last time, face to face, maybe she could reason with him, bargain with him, or at least make him understand the damage he was causing. Michael suggested a motel on the outskirts of town, far from familiar eyes, a place where no one would notice them slipping in together. With her nerves frayed and fear pressing heavily on her chest, Emily agreed. Inside the room, Michael was already waiting. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and sharp. Gone was the playful charm that once drew her to him. In its place was a kind of hunger, not for love, but for control. Emily begged him to stop, to let her go, to leave her marriage untouched. She even offered him money if that was what he needed, anything to keep him from exposing her. But Michael wasn't interested in money. He told her she belonged to him, that her past gave him power over her, and that he would never let her go. His voice was steady, calculated, and cruel. The argument grew louder, heated words bouncing off the motel walls. Neighbors later recalled hearing muffled shouting, though at the time they assumed it was just another lover's quarrel in a cheap room. Emily's desperation collided with Michael's obsession until the air itself felt charged with danger. A glass was knocked to the floor, shattering. A chair scraped across the tile. And then, in the chaos of their struggle, everything changed. By morning, the motel manager unlocked the door after noticing it had not been vacated. Inside, the room was in disarray. The sheets were tangled, the lamp was overturned, and blood stained the carpet. Michael Hayes was slumped beside the bed, lifeless, his body marked with deep wounds that told a violent story. There was no question. He had been murdered. The police swarmed the scene. They collected fingerprints, photographed the overturned furniture, and examined every detail of the crime. Almost immediately, Emily became their primary suspect. Her car had been caught on nearby surveillance cameras entering the lot late at night. Her fingerprints were everywhere. On the door handle, on the glass, on the table. To investigators, it looked like the perfect picture of a scorned lover driven to rage. When questioned, Emily gave little away. She admitted she knew Michael but refused to explain why she had been at the motel that night. Her silence only deepened the suspicion. To the detectives, her refusal to cooperate suggested guilt. To the public, the story became scandalous gossip. The woman who had always seemed so graceful and composed was now at the center of a murder investigation. Rumors began to spread through the community. Neighbors whispered about her late nights, about how quiet she had become, about the possibility that she was hiding something much bigger than an affair. For those who had admired her, it was shocking. For others, it was fuel for speculation. The picture of a perfect wife and neighbor had shattered in an instant, replaced by the image of a cold, calculating killer. What no one realized yet was that Michael had left behind more than his body. Hidden among his belongings were the pieces of Emily's past that he had uncovered. The documents, the notes, the proof of her transition. To the detectives sorting through his things, it was just another part of the case. But for Emily, it was the nightmare she had always feared. Her most closely guarded secret was no longer safe in her hands. It was in the possession of the very people who were now trying to prove her guilty of murder. As the investigation deepened, Emily's life unraveled further. Daniel looked at her with confusion and suspicion, unable to understand why his wife was entangled in such a crime. Friends withdrew. Unsure how to reconcile the woman, they thought they knew with the headlines they were now reading. The weight of the murder and the threat of her past colliding was almost unbearable. In that motel room, Michael Hayes had lost his life. But for Emily Carter, the discovery of his body marked the end of her carefully constructed world. The murder was only the beginning of the storm that would follow, a storm that would expose everything she had fought to keep hidden. Detectives began piecing together the fragments of what had happened on the night Michael Hayes died. The motel room told part of the story: violence, desperation, and a struggle that ended in blood. But the evidence left behind only complicated matters. Emily's fingerprints were everywhere. Her car had been spotted in the parking lot, and witnesses remembered hearing raised voices. On the surface, it seemed clear that she had lured Michael there, fought with him, and left him dead on the floor. Yet the closer investigators looked, the more tangled the case became. Among Michael's belongings, officers found a folder stuffed with papers. Inside were old medical records, photocopies of outdated identification documents, and scribbled notes connecting the name Emily Carter to a very different identity she had carried years earlier. It became clear that Michael had been digging into her past with obsessive detail. The discovery shocked investigators. What had begun as a straightforward murder case now appeared layered with blackmail, secrets, and the possibility of motive far more complex than simple passion. When Daniel was called in for questioning, he sat stunned. He admitted he knew nothing about Emily's transition and could barely process the information being presented to him. To him, the revelation felt like betrayal piled on top of another betrayal. First the affair, now this hidden past. Detectives watched his reaction closely, noting his confusion and pain. Word of Emily's history did not stay contained within the walls of the interrogation room. Once whispers spread, the media seized it like wildfire. Headlines painted her as deceptive, manipulative, and dangerous. In their eyes, she had not only cheated but lived a double life. The small town fed on the story. Neighbors who once admired Emily as a model wife now whispered about what else she might have been hiding. Every friendly smile she had offered in the past was reinterpreted as part of a facade. The scandal overshadowed the details of the murder investigation itself. To many, Emily's secret identity was the real crime. Inside the police station, however, detectives knew they had to build a stronger case than public gossip. They examined the weapon used in Michael's murder, a knife found near the body. Strangely, it did not carry Emily's fingerprints. Instead, there were partial prints that could not be immediately matched to her or to Michael. This inconsistency nagged at the lead investigator. If Emily had killed Michael in a heated struggle, why wasn't her DNA on the weapon? Still, the circumstantial evidence was strong. She had motive. Michael threatened to expose her secret. She had opportunity. Her presence at the motel was undeniable. And she had silence. Her refusal to explain what had happened that night made her look more guilty with every passing hour. For prosecutors preparing their case, it was enough to push forward. Daniel withdrew from her completely. He stopped visiting her during questioning, stopped taking her calls, and stopped defending her when neighbors whispered. For years he had believed they shared honesty and trust. Now he was left with the image of a woman who had deceived him from the beginning. For Emily, his distance hurt more than the judgment of strangers. Losing him was the final confirmation that the life she had built was crumbling. Detectives continued combing through Michael's personal life. Financial records painted a different picture of him than the charming colleague Emily had once fallen for. He was deep in debt, owing money to people known for violent methods of collection. Friends testified that he had become paranoid in recent months, convinced that someone was after him. These details complicated the narrative of a jealous lover's fight. Perhaps Michael's death wasn't as simple as Emily silencing a man who threatened her. Perhaps he had other enemies, ones far more dangerous. But Emily's silence continued to work against her. She refused to tell police the full story of her affair, refused to admit the depth of Michael's blackmail, and refused to explain why she left the motel before his death. Every question left unanswered made her look colder and more calculated. The media latched onto her composure, branding her as manipulative. In their stories, she was no longer just a wife accused of murder. She was a liar who had lived 2 lives and killed to keep them hidden. The case turned into a spectacle. Cameras gathered outside the courthouse, reporters fought for sound bites, and strangers debated her guilt. In the eyes of the public, Emily was already convicted long before she ever stepped into a courtroom. Her past identity, something she had guarded with such care, was now splashed across newspapers and television screens, dissected by people who had never known her. The investigators had no choice but to move forward. The evidence they had was messy but compelling enough to suggest she was responsible. Though the inconsistencies with the weapon lingered, the weight of her silence and the mountain of circumstantial proof pointed straight at her. Emily, once the quiet neighbor who blended so easily into suburban life, was now the center of one of the most sensational cases the town had ever seen. She had not only lost her marriage and her reputation, she was standing at the edge of a trial that could take away her freedom forever. And with Michael's secrets now in police hands, the story was no longer about one man's death. It was about the unmasking of a life she thought would never be exposed. The trial began under the glare of cameras and curious eyes. From the moment Emily walked into the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with judgment. Reporters scribbled furiously, photographers snapped pictures of her every expression, and the public gallery buzzed with whispers. To them she was not just a defendant, she was a story, a scandal, and a symbol of deception. Every step she took, every glance she made was dissected by strangers who believed they already knew the truth. Prosecutors wasted no time painting her as a calculating woman who had lured Michael Hayes into a dangerous affair. They argued that when he discovered her past and threatened to expose it, she silenced him in the most final way possible. They spoke of betrayal, secrecy, and lies, weaving a narrative that left jurors with the image of a woman driven to kill to protect the life she had built on deception. They held up her silence as proof of guilt, pointing out that an innocent person would have spoken freely, not hidden behind vague answers. The defense countered by presenting Emily as a victim of blackmail and manipulation. They told the jury about Michael's obsession, his threats, and his relentless digging into her past. They highlighted the inconsistencies in the forensic evidence, the lack of her DNA on the weapon, the partial fingerprints that did not match her or Michael, and the financial troubles that connected Michael to dangerous people. They argued that his death was not the result of her desperation, but of his own recklessness with debts he could not pay. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Neighbors testified about Emily's sudden change in behavior before the murder, her distracted looks, her restless nights. Former colleagues of Michael described his growing paranoia, the way he talked about owing money to the wrong people. A motel worker recounted seeing Emily arrive that night, but could not confirm whether she was still there when Michael's life ended. Each testimony added new layers, but none provided a clear answer. The most shocking moment came when surveillance footage was introduced. It showed a shadowy figure entering the motel room after Emily had already left. The image was grainy, the figure unidentifiable, but the timing could not be ignored. If Emily had killed Michael, why would someone else have entered the room shortly after her departure? The defense seized on this, arguing that it was proof of another hand in the crime. The prosecution dismissed it as coincidence, suggesting Emily could have staged the scene and the figure was irrelevant. As days stretched into weeks, the trial consumed the town. Every evening, news programs replayed courtroom footage, analyzing Emily's body language, speculating on her motives, and inviting experts to argue whether she was guilty or not. For many, the murder itself became secondary. What fascinated them most was her identity, the life she had lived before Daniel, and the secret she had kept for so long. The courtroom was no longer just about whether she had killed Michael, it had become a public trial of who she truly was. Daniel sat through the proceedings in silence, his face unreadable. He had once been her partner, her closest ally, but now he looked like a stranger. When reporters asked him about Emily, he offered no defense and no condemnation. His absence of words spoke louder than any statement could. For Emily, it was another wound, sharper than the accusations of strangers. Finally, after weeks of arguments, testimonies, and speculation, the jury reached its verdict. Emily held her breath as the foreperson stood, the courtroom silent except for the rustling of paper. The words that followed changed everything. She was acquitted of murder. The jury believed there was reasonable doubt that the evidence against her did not outweigh the inconsistencies and the possibility of other suspects. For a moment, relief washed over her. She was not going to prison. The weight of a life sentence had been lifted. But the relief was fleeting. Freedom did not mean restoration. Her secret was no longer hers. The trial had exposed her transition to the world, dragged it into headlines, and etched it into the memories of her neighbors and community. The marriage she once valued was gone. Her reputation shattered, her privacy destroyed. Emily left the courthouse a free woman but not a whole one. The cameras still followed her, the whispers still echoed, and the eyes of strangers still judged her. She had escaped the walls of a prison, but not the shadow of what had been revealed. The life she had built was gone, replaced by a hollow version of survival. The murder of Michael Hayes faded from headlines in time, replaced by new stories and scandals. But for Emily, the echoes of that night never ended. The motel room, the threats, the exposure of her past, all of it lingered like scars carved too deep to heal. She had been acquitted of killing a man, but she could never acquit herself from the choices and secrets that had led her there.